Imagine a vibrant crowd, faces filled with joy as the Ark of the Covenant, the ultimate symbol of divine presence, is finally brought back. To the sound of songs and melodies from instruments, the people rejoice. A gentle afternoon breeze softly sways the trees as the sunlight reflects the path. Everything seemed to be in perfect harmony. David, God's chosen king, led the procession with a heart full of gratitude and hope. But within seconds, everything would change. A fatal mistake, an outstretched hand, and silence fell over the crowd. The oxen carrying the cart stumbled, the ark swayed, and Uzzah, without hesitation, reached out his hand to prevent what seemed like an imminent disaster. What he did not know in that decisive moment was that the real danger was not the ark falling, but violating God's instructions. The sound of his body hitting the ground echoed among the people, while shock and fear replaced their joy. God reacted instantly, and Uzzah fell dead. This event, described in 2 Samuel chapter 6, verses 6 and 7, confuses and even troubles us. How could God, who is full of compassion, act so harshly? Wasn't Uzzah trying to protect the Ark of the Covenant? The answer to this question lies in the depths of God's holiness and the necessity of strictly obeying his commands. The lesson this passage brings is one of the most powerful about obedience, reverence, and the sovereign power of the Lord. However, before jumping to conclusions, it is crucial to understand what was truly at stake. Uzzah's death was not a simple accident. It was a clear sign that God's laws cannot be treated lightly, even when intentions seem just. Have you ever reflected on the consequences of subtly straying from the path God has laid out for your life? Now, what really happened that day? And how does it apply to your life today? Stay with us, because the answer to these questions might completely transform your perception of God's justice and mercy. In ancient times, the Ark of the Covenant was more than just a religious symbol. It represented the very presence of God among his people. Guarded with extreme care, the Ark contained the 10 Commandments and other sacred objects. It was carried by the Israelites into battle, with the assurance that God's presence accompanied them. Its transport and care were surrounded by detailed instructions, and any deviation from these orders was considered a direct challenge to God himself. It is within this context that Uzzah emerges as one of the individuals responsible for safeguarding the ark, a privilege that demanded absolute obedience. Uzzah's story takes place during a moment of great joy. David, the king of Israel, had decided to bring the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem after it had been away for years. This event was supposed to be a landmark in the history of God's chosen people. Crowds gathered around, celebrating with songs and dances. The responsibility of transporting the ark was given to Uzzah and his brother Ahio. They placed it on an ox cart, an action that already violated God's instructions, as the ark was supposed to be carried on the shoulders of the Levitical priests. As a temporary guardian of the ark, Uzzah likely felt the weight of this responsibility. His role was to ensure that nothing happened to the most sacred object of the Hebrew people. However, by allowing it to be carried in an improper manner, Uzzah had already begun breaking an important divine rule. Even without realizing it, he was participating in an act of disobedience. God's plan for transporting the ark was clear, but negligence, perhaps out of ignorance or carelessness, created a dangerous situation for everyone present. When the oxen pulling the cart stumbled, the ark swayed, and Uzzah instinctively reached out to steady it. In a human reflex, he tried to prevent the sacred object from falling to the ground. But what seemed like an act of protection would prove to be a fatal transgression. God had decreed that the ark could not be touched by common hands. Uzzah, not being a Levite, touched the object that represented God's holiness, violating divine order and consequently incurring the Lord's wrath. It is important to highlight that Uzzah's role was not only to protect the ark physically, but also to respect the commandments associated with it. His failure lay not just in the act of stretching out his hand, but in not rigorously following what God had prescribed. It was a reminder that the respect for divine laws could not be compromised, even in moments of urgency. By breaking the law, Uzzah demonstrated a lack of reverence for what was sacred, even though there was no apparent intent to offend. Thus, the historical context of the Ark, combined with Uzzah's role, sets the stage for one of the Bible's deepest lessons: the importance of faithfully obeying God's instructions without deviation, even when the purpose may seem just in human eyes. This story prepares us for the dramatic moment that follows, where the consequences of Uzzah's action manifest immediately and definitively. The atmosphere was filled with joy. The sound of instruments and the people's songs filled the air with celebration as the Ark of the Covenant slowly made its way towards Jerusalem. The ox cart carrying the sacred object moved forward through the crowds until something unexpected happened. The oxen stumbled, and the Ark began to sway dangerously. In that instant, Uzzah, in an almost automatic reflex, reached out his hand to steady it, an action that, in anyone's eyes, seemed like the right thing to do. But the moment Uzzah touched the Ark, something happened that no one could have predicted. The presence of God, which rested on the Ark, reacted immediately and powerfully. Uzzah's hand, which intended to protect, became the channel through which divine wrath was unleashed. He fell lifeless to the ground. The people around him were stunned, unable to comprehend at first what had just happened. The joyful atmosphere was replaced by shock and fear. The same Ark that symbolized God's presence had now become the stage for a manifestation of his justice. Uzzah's sudden death seemed harsh, almost incomprehensible. After all, wasn't he trying to keep the Ark from falling to the ground? To human eyes, his gesture might have seemed noble, but God had given clear orders on how the Ark of the Covenant was to be handled. Any violation of these rules, even if unintentional, was viewed as disrespect towards God's holiness. Uzzah's touch, although well-intentioned, violated the sacred command that the Ark could not be touched by common hands. The impact of this action resonated deeply in David's heart and in the hearts of all the people. The initial joy was replaced by a renewed understanding of the seriousness of God's presence. At that moment, everyone realized that proximity to the divine required absolute reverence. It was not enough to have good intentions. Strictly obeying God's instructions was essential. Uzzah's death was a painful reminder that God's holiness could not be disregarded or treated lightly. Unfortunately, Uzzah paid with his life for an action that, in his mind, could have been justified as necessary. But God's plan was greater than human understanding. By touching the Ark, Uzzah inadvertently crossed the line between the profane and the sacred, something God had warned about repeatedly in the Scriptures. God's wrath was not an act of cruelty, but a reminder that his laws were non-negotiable and unchangeable, regardless of the circumstances. This event was not only about Uzzah's death, but about the seriousness of the relationship between God and his people. The Ark of the Covenant represented something much greater than a sacred object. It was the symbol of God's very presence, and any action that endangered that holiness would bring severe consequences. Uzzah's story makes us reflect on obedience and the respect we must have before sacred things, reminding us that God's mercy and justice walk hand in hand. The sudden death of Uzzah confronts us with a crucial issue: obedience to God's commands. From the beginning, the Lord had given specific instructions on how the Ark of the Covenant should be handled. These laws were not mere suggestions, but clear commands intended to protect the holiness of his presence among the people. When Uzzah reached out to touch the Ark, he disregarded these instructions, even if unconsciously. The message was clear: obedience to God's commandments is non-negotiable, and any transgression, however small it may seem, carries consequences. This episode highlights a fundamental truth about the relationship between man and the Creator. Obedience to divine laws is not based merely on human understanding of right and wrong, but on a profound respect for God's authority. Uzzah acted according to his immediate perception of an emergency, but ignored the principle established by God. Touching something as sacred as the Ark of the Covenant required a holiness that he, not being a priest, did not possess. Uzzah's death was not merely a punishment, but a symbol of the necessity of reverencing God's holiness. Obedience in this context goes beyond simply following rules. It is a reflection of total submission to God's will, recognizing that He, and He alone, defines what is sacred. Uzzah's attitude, though well-intentioned, reveals the fragility of human understanding compared to the greatness of the divine. What seemed like an act of protection was, in fact, a violation of God's orders. This incident teaches us that true obedience does not rely on our own judgments, but on faithfully following the directions established by the Lord. The symbolic meaning of Uzzah's death extends far beyond the immediate moment. It serves as a warning against becoming overly familiar with what is holy. Sometimes, in our spiritual walk, we can grow accustomed to God's presence and forget that He is holy and deserves our utmost reverence. Just like Uzzah, we risk acting impulsively, relying on our limited perception without considering what God has already instructed in His Word. His death is a solemn reminder that God's presence must be treated with the highest respect. David, who witnessed this tragedy, was deeply impacted by what had occurred. He understood in that moment that obedience to God was not something that could be interpreted subjectively. The divine wrath that manifested against Uzzah was a sign that, even amid joy and celebration, God required His instructions to be followed precisely. Uzzah's death marks a symbolic point in the history of Israel, pointing to the importance of total and sincere obedience to God's laws, regardless of the circumstances. Thus, the tragic outcome of Uzzah's life delivers a powerful message. God's holiness is non-negotiable, and obedience to His commandments is the only way to honor His presence. The story invites us to reflect on our own actions and motivations, reminding us that in the presence of the divine, we must act with reverence, always putting God's will above any other consideration. The story of Uzzah provides one of the most impactful lessons about the holiness of God. The Ark of the Covenant, which symbolized the very presence of the divine, was treated with the utmost respect because it represented the place where the Lord dwelt among His people. When Uzzah touched the Ark, he crossed a boundary established by God Himself, reminding us that what is sacred must be treated with absolute reverence. The act of touching the Ark was an act of desecration, even if unintentional, and God's response was a reminder that His laws are immutable. This story teaches us that God's holiness cannot be compromised. Often, humanity approaches the sacred in an irreverent manner, underestimating the greatness and purity of God. The Ark of the Covenant was not just an object, it was the symbol of God's covenant with His people, and any violation of His orders was seen as a direct disrespect to His majesty. Uzzah's mistake leads us to reflect on how we treat the sacred things in our own lives, whether in our relationship with God or in how we live our daily lives. Obedience to God's commandments is a central theme in this story. By touching the Ark, Uzzah ignored the clear instructions given to Israel on how to handle the holiness of God. This reckless act teaches us that no matter how good our intentions may be, following God's divine laws cannot be neglected. God does not demand perfection from us, but He requires obedience. When we follow His instructions, we show respect for His authority and His will. On the other hand, when we deviate, even with the best of intentions, we risk suffering the consequences of our disobedience. This story also reveals the difference between human thinking and divine purpose. To Uzzah, holding the Ark steady may have seemed like the right thing to do, but God's plans extend beyond our comprehension. He establishes His laws not based on what seems logical to us, but on what is just in His eyes. This challenges us to trust God more deeply, even when His instructions appear contrary to what we believe is best. That trust manifests in obedience to His commandments, even when we do not fully understand the reason behind them. The story of Uzzah also highlights the importance of fearing the Lord. This fear is not a paralyzing terror, but a profound respect for His holiness and justice. When we approach God with a reverent heart, we recognize how great and powerful He truly is. Uzzah failed to understand that God's holiness required more than mere human zeal. It required total obedience. This lesson extends to us today, reminding us that God's holiness should never be treated lightly. Therefore, Uzzah's death confronts us with an eternal truth. God is holy, and His laws are just. He invites us to obey Him with a sincere and reverent heart. When we recognize the magnitude of His holiness, we learn to live more humbly and obediently. May this story inspire us to seek a deeper relationship with God, based on respect and faithfulness to His instructions. Uzzah's death is one of those moments in Scripture that causes us to pause and reflect deeply. A moment of carelessness, an action that seemed simple, and suddenly the life of a man is taken away instantly. But this story is not just about human error. It serves as a poignant reminder that God is holy, and His instructions cannot be ignored or adapted to fit our understanding. Obedience to Him must be complete, not partial. More than a tragedy, Uzzah's account confronts us with essential questions. Are we treating with reverence the things that God has entrusted to us? Are we approaching God's presence with the respect He deserves? Or like Uzzah, are we risking touching what is sacred, ignoring His instructions, and trusting more in our instincts than in His word? This story also teaches us about the consequences of disobedience to God, even when our intentions are good. Perhaps in your life, you have also tried to help God by interfering impulsively in His plans, without following the directions He has clearly established. Today, Uzzah's death serves as a warning. Obedience is non-negotiable. God calls us to follow Him wholeheartedly, trusting that His ways are always better than ours. So what does this lesson mean for you? Are you fully obeying the directions God has given you? Or like Uzzah, are you relying more on your own understanding, believing you are doing what is right even when it contradicts God's commandments? Uzzah's story is an invitation for us to reevaluate our obedience and respect for God's holiness. Now is the time to take the next step. Don't let this message stop here. Obedience to God's word has the power to transform lives, including yours. Subscribe to the channel to receive more teachings that will deepen your faith, and activate notifications so you never miss a lesson that could change the course of your walk with God. Also, don't forget to check out the next video that will appear on your screen, where we will explore more surprising lessons about God's justice and mercy. Share this message with those who need to hear it, and together, let's follow in obedience and faith.